When the wind stops, of the silence after the tornado was what Pauline Mercer would remember most. Not the howling wind that had torn her house apart, board by board, not the crash of the oak tree through her bedroom ceiling, not even the moment she'd huddled in the basement, clutching her late husband's photograph while the world exploded above her. It was the silence that followed, thick, unnatural, profound, that would haunt her dreams. She stood now in what used to be her living room, 73 years old and trembling, her slippers caked with mud and debris. The morning sun streamed through gaps where walls should have been, illuminating the wreckage of a life built over 5 decades. Her grandmother's china lay shattered across the warped floorboards. The family photos that had lined the mantelpiece were scattered like fallen leaves, some torn, others miraculously intact, but water-stained beyond recognition. The insurance adjuster had left an hour ago with his clipboard and practiced sympathy, explaining in careful terms that her policy would cover replacement value but not the memories, as if memories had a price, as if you could walk into a store and buy back the sound of your husband humming while he shaved, or the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame tracking your son's growth through childhood. Pauline picked up a fragment of her wedding china, part of the rem from the soup bowls she and Harold had received 51 years ago. The gold edge had worn thin over the years, but it had survived every move, every dinner party, every holiday gathering. Now it lay in pieces, just like everything else. Her hands shook as she set the fragment on what remained of the kitchen counter. The tornado had been an EF4, they said. Wind speeds up to 190 miles per hour. It had carved a path 3 blocks wide and 12 miles long through Millbrook, leaving behind a landscape that looked like a war zone. Pauline's house had been in the direct path. She should call David. Her son would want to know she was safe, even if they hadn't spoken much since Harold's funeral 2 years ago. Their relationship had grown complicated after that, strained by grief and the weight of unspoken expectations. But surely now, in the face of this disaster, those petty grievances would fall away. Her cell phone had somehow survived in her purse, though the screen was cracked like a spiderweb. She scrolled through her contacts until she found David's number. Her finger hovered over the call button for a moment. What would she say? How do you sum up the complete destruction of your life in a phone call? The phone rang 3 times before David answered. Mom? Jesus, I've been trying to reach you all morning. I saw the news about the tornado. Are you okay? His voice carried the familiar mixture of concern and impatience that she'd grown accustomed to over the years. David was a successful architect in Chicago, busy with his practice and his own family. He inherited Harold's efficiency, but none of his warmth. I'm alive, Pauline said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. But the house, David, it's gone. Everything is gone. Silence stretched between them across the hundreds of miles. She could hear traffic in the background, the distant hum of his office air conditioning. Gone? What do you mean, gone? There's nothing left. The roof, most of the walls. The basement saved my life, but upstairs? I don't know what I'm going to do. Another pause. When David spoke again, his voice had shifted into what she thought of as his business tone, the voice he used with difficult clients and stubborn contractors. Okay, we need to think about this logically. You have insurance, right? And FEMA will probably have disaster relief funds. Let me make some calls. David, I need somewhere to stay. Just temporarily until... Mom. The word came out sharp, cutting her off mid-sentence. Look, I understand this is difficult, but you know Linda and I are going through some things. The kids are stressed with school, and we're trying to work on our marriage. We need privacy right now. We need space. The words hit her like physical blows. We want privacy. She stood there in the ruins of her life, surrounded by 51 years of memories reduced to debris, and her son, her only child, was talking about privacy. I wouldn't be any trouble. I could help with the kids, maybe cook. That's not the point. It's just not a good time. There are hotels, right? Or maybe you could stay with one of your friends temporarily. Her friends. Margaret had moved to Florida 3 years ago. Betty was in a nursing home with dementia. Joan had died last spring. The truth was, at 73, after a lifetime of taking care of others, her world had gradually shrunk to the size of her house, the house that no longer existed. "I understand," she said, though she didn't understand at all. She understood the words, but not how her son could speak them to her. Not how the boy she'd rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, the teenager she'd waited up for on Friday nights, the man she'd stood beside him at his father's grave, could listen to her say she'd lost everything and respond by protecting her privacy. "I'll figure something out," she added, because the silence was growing uncomfortable and she could sense David's impatience building. "Good, that's good. And Mom, maybe this is actually an opportunity, a chance to downsize, move somewhere more manageable. Maybe one of those senior communities. You don't need such a big house anymore." She wanted to tell him that it hadn't been a big house. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a kitchen where she'd made his birthday cakes every year until he turned 18. She wanted to tell him that the size of the house wasn't the point, that it had been their house, where he'd taken his first steps, where Harold had taught him to tie his shoes, where they'd been a family. Instead, she said, "I should go. There are people I need to call. Keep me posted, all right? And Mom, I really am glad you're safe." The line went dead. Pauline stared at the cracked screen of her phone for a long time, watching the sunlight shift patterns across the debris at her feet. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sounds of recovery. Chainsaws clearing fallen trees, the backup alarms of heavy machinery, neighbors calling to each other across the wasteland that had once been a quiet suburban street. "We want privacy." The words echoed in her mind as she picked her way carefully through what remained of her kitchen. She found herself in front of the refrigerator, which had somehow stayed upright, though its contents had been scattered across the floor. A few magnets had survived, holding fragments of memories, a grocery list in her handwriting, David's Christmas card from last year featuring a stiff family portrait, and a recipe card for Harold's favorite apple pie that she'd never made since his death. She peeled off the Christmas card and studied the faces in the photograph. David looked prosperous and satisfied, his arm around Linda's shoulders in a gesture that seemed more possessive than affectionate. The kids, Emma, 12, and Michael, 15, smiled dutifully at the camera. They were beautiful children, her grandchildren, though she'd seen them perhaps a dozen times in the past 5 years. David was always too busy, the kids had too many activities, and Linda preferred to spend holidays with her own family. "We want privacy." She tucked a card into her purse and made her way outside, stepping carefully over the debris. The Red Cross had set up a station at the elementary school 3 blocks away, she'd been told. They would have coffee and sandwiches, maybe a place to sit and think about what came next. The walk through her neighborhood was surreal. Some houses had been completely destroyed, reduced to piles of timber and twisted metal. Others stood virtually untouched, as if the tornado had been playing some cruel game of chance. The Hendersons' house next door had lost its roof, but was otherwise intact. Mrs. Henderson waved at her from the front yard, where she was sorting through water-damaged belongings. "Pauline, thank God you're all right. We were so worried when we saw your place." Pauline managed a smile. "I'm fine. How are you folks doing?" "Oh, we'll manage. Insurance adjuster says we'll be in a hotel for a few months while they rebuild the roof, but we're alive. That's what matters." Mrs. Henderson paused, studying Pauline's face with the kind of perception that comes from 30 years of being neighbors. "Where will you stay?" The question hung in the air between them. Pauline found herself unable to answer. Where would she stay? In her old life, before the tornado, she might have had options. But that life was gone now, as thoroughly destroyed as the house behind her. "I'm not sure yet," she said finally. "I'm working on it." Mrs. Henderson nodded, but her expression was troubled. "If you need anything, I mean, we don't have much space in the hotel, but..." "That's very kind of you. I'll be fine." The lie came easily, perhaps because she'd been telling it to herself for years. "I'm fine." She'd said it when Harold died, when David's calls became less frequent, when she realized she could go days without speaking to another human being. I'm fine. It was the default response of her generation, the women who'd learned to carry their burdens privately and ask for help only as a last resort. The Red Cross station was a hub of controlled chaos. Volunteers with clipboards and kind eyes shepherded displaced families through the process of immediate aid. Blankets, food, temporary shelter vouchers. Pauline accepted a cup of coffee and a sandwich she didn't want, then found a quiet corner where she could think. She pulled out her phone again and scrolled through her contacts. The list was depressingly short. A few doctor's offices, the pharmacy, the grocery store, the pizza place that delivered, David's number. And then, near the bottom, a name she hadn't thought about in years. Thomas McKenna. She stared at the entry, wondering why she'd kept his number all these years. They'd been friends on Facebook, the kind of distant digital connection that allowed glimpses into each other's lives without real intimacy. She knew he lived in Wisconsin now, that he'd been widowed 5 years ago, that he still played guitar in a local blues band despite being 75 years old. Thomas McKenna. Her first love. Her only love, really, before Harold. They'd met in high school, 1968, when the world was changing and anything seemed possible. He'd been the boy who played guitar at school assemblies, who wrote her poetry on notebook paper, who'd promised they'd run away to California and live on the beach. They'd been inseparable for 3 years, planning a future that seemed as real and solid as the ground beneath their feet. Then came graduation and college applications, and the sudden realization that their dreams were colliding with other people's expectations. Thomas had wanted to study music at Berkeley. Pauline's parents had insisted she attend the local teachers' college and marry someone practical, someone stable, someone like Harold Mercer, who came from a good family and had steady prospects in his father's hardware business. The fight that ended their relationship was vicious and final. Thomas had accused her of being a coward, of choosing safety over love. She'd accused him of being selfish, of not understanding that some people couldn't afford to chase fantasies. They'd said things that couldn't be taken back. And then he'd left for California without her. She'd married Harold 2 years later. It had been a good marriage, comfortable, stable, exactly what her parents had wanted for her. Harold was a kind man who provided well and never raised his voice. They'd raised David together, built a life together, and if it sometimes felt more like a business partnership than a great romance, well, that was probably more realistic anyway. Love, she'd learned, was less important than compatibility. But she'd never forgotten Thomas. Even during the happiest years of her marriage, even when David was young and the house was full of laughter and chaos, she'd sometimes catch herself wondering what would have happened if she'd been braver, if she'd chosen love over security. Now, sitting in a Red Cross shelter with nowhere to go and no one to call, she found herself staring at his name on her phone screen. It was ridiculous. They hadn't spoken in 50 years. Their last conversation was ugly, full of hurt and accusations. He probably didn't even remember her, and if he did, it wasn't likely to be fondly. She'd broken his heart, after all. She'd chosen another man, another life. But what did she have to lose? She'd already lost everything else. Her finger trembled as she pressed his number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. She was about to hang up when a voice answered. Deeper than she remembered, roughened by age and years, but unmistakably his. Hello?
She couldn't speak. 50 years collapsed in an instant, and she was 18 again, hearing his voice for the first time in the hallway at school. Hello? He said again. Is someone there? Thomas? The word came out as barely a whisper. Silence. Then, Polly. Polly Carlson? No one had called her that in 5 decades. The nickname brought tears to her eyes. Yes, it's me. My God! She could hear the shock in his voice, and something else, something that might have been joy. Polly, I can't believe... Where are you? How did you... Why are you calling? She laughed, and it came out half sob. It's a long story. I have time. I have all the time in the world. And so she told him about Harold's death, about the growing distance with David, about the tornado and the house, and the terrible conversation that morning when she'd learned exactly where she stood in her son's priorities. She told him about sitting in a Red Cross shelter with nowhere to go and no one to call, and how she'd found his number in her phone like a message from her past self. He listened without interrupting, making soft sounds of sympathy and understanding. When she finished, the silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who know each other deeply, even across decades of separation. Jesus, Polly, I'm so sorry about your husband, about the house, about your son being such an ass. She found herself smiling through her tears. Thomas had never been one to mince words. You always did cut straight to the heart of things. Some things don't change. Listen, where are you right now? What do you need? The question was so simple, so direct, that it caught her off guard. David had asked what she was going to do, as if her homelessness was a problem she needed to solve on her own. Thomas was asking what she needed, as if he was prepared to help her solve it. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know what I need. A place to sleep tonight, I suppose. Time to figure out what comes next. Where exactly are you? Millbrook. It's about an hour north of Indianapolis. I know where Millbrook is. I grew up there, remember? His voice was warm with something that might have been fondness. Listen, I'm gonna drive down there. Can you meet me somewhere? Thomas, no, you don't need to. Where can I pick you up? She looked around the Red Cross shelter, at the families huddled together, at the volunteers bustling between tables laden with donated clothes and canned goods, at the life she'd never imagined for herself. The elementary school on Maple Street. There's a Red Cross station here. I'll be there in 4 hours.
Thomas, wait. But the line had gone dead. She stared at her phone in amazement. In the space of a 20-minute conversation, her entire situation had changed. A man she hadn't spoken to in 50 years was driving 4 hours to pick her up from the wreckage of her life. She spent the next few hours in a state of nervous anticipation, alternately convincing herself that he wouldn't actually come and panicking about what she'd say if he did. She accepted another cup of coffee from a volunteer, used the restroom to attempt to make herself presentable, and found herself studying her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She was 73 years old. Her hair was more gray than brown now, pulled back in the practical bun she'd worn for decades. The face looking back at her was lined with age and grief, marked by years of small disappointments and quiet compromises. Would he recognize her? Would he be disappointed by what she'd become? When she emerged from the bathroom, a volunteer approached her with a clipboard. Mrs. Mercer, I have some information about temporary housing options. There's a shelter about 20 miles from here that has space, and there are some hotel vouchers available if you prefer privacy. Privacy. The word stung, carrying as it did the echo of David's rejection. Thank you, she said, taking the papers, but I think I may have other arrangements. The volunteer smiled. That's wonderful. Family? Pauline hesitated. What was Thomas to her now? Not family, certainly. Not a stranger, either. Something in between. Something undefined. A friend, she said finally. An old friend. At exactly 4:30 p.m., a dark blue pickup truck pulled into the school parking lot. Pauline watched from the window as the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Tall, still lean despite his age, his hair white but thick. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had earned its aches. It was Thomas. Unmistakably Thomas, though changed by 50 years of living. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, a flutter of recognition and fear, and something she didn't want to name. She gathered her purse, the only possession she had left, and walked outside. He was waiting by the truck, his hands shoved in his pockets, and when he saw her, his face broke into a smile that erased decades in an instant. Polly,
They stood there for a moment, two elderly people in a school parking lot, carrying between them the weight of a shared history and a lifetime of separation. Then Thomas opened his arms, and she walked into them without thinking, and it felt like coming home. He smelled like wood shavings and coffee, with an undertone of the cologne he'd worn in high school. His embrace was careful but warm, and she allowed herself to lean into it, to accept comfort from another human being for the first time in years. "You look beautiful," he said when they separated, and she could see in his eyes that he meant it, that he was seeing not just the elderly woman she'd become, but the girl she'd been. "I look terrible. I look like I've been through a tornado." "Well, that's because you have been through a tornado. Come on, let's get you out of here." The cab of his truck was clean and comfortable, with a thermos of coffee in the cup holder and the kind of country music station that played songs from their youth. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Pauline found herself looking back at the Red Cross station, at the temporary structure that had represented the complete uncertainty of her future just hours before. "Where are we going?" "My place. It's not fancy, but it's got a spare bedroom and a working kitchen. You can stay as long as you need to." "Thomas, I can't just move in with you. We haven't seen each other in 50 years. You don't know anything about who I am now." He glanced at her as he merged onto the highway. "I know you're the same woman who called me when she had nowhere else to turn. I know you're the same person who used to sneak out of her bedroom window to meet me under the old oak tree behind the school. I know you still bite your lower lip when you're nervous. And I know that if the situation was reversed, you'd do the same for me." She touched her lips self-consciously. She hadn't realized she was biting it. "That girl you knew, she made some terrible choices. She hurt you badly. That girl grew up and had a life. She married someone else and raised a child, and probably had more happiness and heartbreak than either of us could have imagined back then. She survived 50 years in a world that wasn't always kind to her." His voice was gentle but firm. "That doesn't erase what we had, Polly. It just makes it part of a bigger story." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the landscape rolling past the windows in shades of late afternoon gold. Pauline felt something loosening in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. For the first time in months, maybe years, she wasn't alone. "Tell me about your life, your wife, your children, what you've been doing all these years." Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. "I married a good woman named Janet. We had 38 years together before the cancer took her. She was nothing like you, practical, steady, no nonsense. She kept me grounded, kept me from chasing too many dreams that would have left us broke." He smiled. "We had 2 daughters. Sarah lives in Seattle with her family, and Lisa is in Denver. They're good kids, both of them. They worry about their old man living alone in the middle of nowhere. But you stayed in music." "Some. I taught high school for 30 years, English and music, coached the jazz band, played in local groups on weekends, never made it to California, never played the blues on the beach like we planned." He shrugged. "But I made music, and I made a difference in some kids' lives. And I had a good marriage, and 2 daughters that turned out better than I probably deserved. Not a bad life." "It sounds like a wonderful life." "It was. And yours, apart from what you told me on the phone." She found herself telling him about Harold. Really telling him. Not just the polite summary she usually gave when people asked. She told him about the quiet companionship of their marriage, the way Harold had been steady and reliable, but never quite passionate about anything. She told him about David as a little boy, how bright and curious he'd been, and about the man he'd become, successful but distant, dutiful but cold. "He's not a bad person," she said. "He's just careful, controlled. He doesn't like messiness, and losing everything in a tornado is certainly messy." "Bullshit," Thomas said mildly. "Excuse me?" "I said bullshit. The man's mother lost her home, and he told her he wanted privacy. That's not careful. That's cruel. Being successful doesn't give you the right to abandon the people who loved you before you were successful." Pauline felt a flutter of something that might have been relief. For 2 years since Harold's death, she'd been making excuses for David's increasing distance. She'd blamed herself for being too needy, too dependent, too much of a burden. It was almost shocking to hear someone else call it what it was. "Maybe," she said,
but he's still my son. And you're still his mother. That should mean something. They turned off the highway onto a county road that wound through farmland and patches of woods. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and Pauline felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. Not the anxious dread that had become her default emotional state, but genuine curiosity about what came next. Thomas's house was a small ranch-style home set back from the road, surrounded by mature trees and a garden that looked well-tended despite the late season. A dog, some kind of lab mix, bounded out to greet them as they pulled into the driveway. That's Django. He's friendly but doesn't have much sense about personal space. The dog was indeed friendly, though he seemed more interested in sniffing Pauline's shoes than jumping on her. She scratched behind his ears and was rewarded with a tail wag that seemed to involve his entire body. "He likes you," Thomas said. "That's a good sign." The inside of the house was comfortable and lived in, with bookshelves lining the walls and a guitar stand in the corner of the living room. There were photographs everywhere, family pictures, shots of Thomas with various musical groups, candid moments that spoke of a life fully lived. "The guest room is just down the hall," Thomas said, carrying her purse for her as if it were heavy luggage. "There are clean sheets on the bed, and the bathroom is right across the hall. Are you hungry? I can make us some dinner." Standing in the doorway of the guest room, Pauline felt suddenly overwhelmed. The simple kindness of clean sheets and an offered meal was almost too much to bear after the day she'd had. She sank into the chair by the window and found herself crying, not the careful, controlled tears she'd shed at Harold's funeral, or the shocked, numb grief she'd felt that morning in the ruins of her house, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere she'd forgotten existed. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and waited. He didn't try to comfort her or tell her everything would be all right. He just waited, the way someone waits for a storm to pass, with patience and the certainty that it will end eventually. When the tears finally subsided, Pauline felt empty but strangely cleansed, as if she had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally been able to set it down. "I'm sorry. It's been a difficult day. Don't apologize for crying after your son abandoned you and a tornado destroyed your house. That seems like exactly the right response to me." She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since he'd picked her up. His face was lined with 75 years of living, marked by sun and laughter, and probably some sorrow. His eyes were the same warm brown she remembered, but they held depths now that hadn't been there when they were teenagers. This was a man who had loved and lost, who had raised children and buried a wife, who had learned the complicated mathematics of a life fully lived. "Why did you come for me? After what happened between us, after all these years, why did you drop everything and drive 4 hours to pick up your high school girlfriend?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "Do you remember the last time we saw each other? Before you called today." She nodded. It was burned into her memory. The fight they had on graduation night, the terrible things they'd said to each other. "You told me I was selfish, that I didn't understand how the real world worked. You said some people couldn't afford to chase dreams." He met her eyes. "You were right, Polly. You were 18 years old, and you already understood something about responsibility and sacrifice that took me decades to learn. You were right too, though. I was a coward. I chose safety over love. Maybe, or maybe you chose one kind of love over another. Love for your parents, your family, your community. Maybe you chose a different kind of bravery. The bravery of staying and building something stable instead of running away to chase a fantasy." They sat in the gathering darkness, two people who had spent 50 years wondering what might have been, finally able to see their younger selves with the clarity that only comes with time. "I never forgot you," Thomas said quietly. "Even during the happiest years of my marriage, even when I was completely in love with Janet, there was always this corner of my heart that belonged to Polly Carlson. Not because what we had was better than what I found later, but because it was first, because it was the love that taught me how to love. I thought about you too, wondered what would have happened if I'd been braver. You want to know what would have happened? We would have been broke and struggling and probably too young to handle the pressure. We might have made it, or we might have destroyed each other. There's no way to know. He reached over and took her hand, wrinkled now, marked by age spots and wedding ring tan lines, but still recognizably hers. But I know this. We're here now, and we're not 18 anymore, and maybe that's exactly when we were supposed to find each other again. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork and the countless small tasks involved in rebuilding a life from nothing. Thomas drove her to meetings with insurance adjusters and FEMA representatives. He sat with her while she tried to create an inventory of everything she lost, a process that proved to be emotionally exhausting in ways she hadn't expected. How do you assign value to your wedding dress, preserved in tissue paper for 51 years? What is a child's first drawing worth to an insurance company? But there were also moments of unexpected grace. Thomas had kept some of their high school memorabilia, old photographs, letters she'd written him, even a pressed flower from a bouquet he'd given her for prom. They spent one evening going through these artifacts of their young love, and Pauline was amazed by the intensity of the emotions preserved in those faded pages. They'd been so earnest, so certain that their love was the most important thing that had ever happened to anyone. "Listen to this," Thomas read from one of her letters. "I know our parents don't understand, but what we have is special. It's not just infatuation or teenage foolishness. It's real love, the kind that lasts forever." He looked up at her with a grin. "It turns out you were right about that, too. I was very wise at 18. It's a shame I spent the next 50 years forgetting everything I knew." "You didn't forget. You just learned some other things, too." They fell into an easy routine. Thomas would make coffee in the morning while she showered, and they'd sit on the back porch watching Django chase squirrels through the garden. They'd drive into town for errands, and Thomas would introduce her to people he'd known for decades. Like, "This is Pauline, an old friend from high school," with a pride in his voice that made her feel valued in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. In the evenings, he'd play guitar while she read or worked on her laptop, researching apartments and trying to piece together a plan for what came next. Sometimes they'd talk late into the night, filling in the gaps of 50 years with stories and memories and observations about how the world had changed. It was on the fifth night, over dinner and a bottle of wine Thomas had been saving for a special occasion, that Pauline finally called David. "I should let him know I'm all right. He's probably wondering what happened to me." "Probably," Thomas agreed, though his tone suggested he had his doubts. David answered on the second ring. "Mom, where the hell have you been? I've been calling for days. The Red Cross said you left the shelter, but they didn't know where you went." "I'm fine, David. I'm staying with a friend." "What friend? I thought you said you didn't have anywhere to go." She could hear the irritation in his voice, the implication that she'd somehow manipulated him. "An old friend from high school. He drove down to pick me up." "He?" "Mom, what are you talking about? You can't just move in with some stranger." "He's not a stranger. His name is Thomas McKenna, and we knew each other long before you were born." There was a pause. McKenna. Wasn't that the name of that guy you dated before Dad, the musician? Pauline was surprised he remembered. She'd mentioned Thomas occasionally over the years, usually in the context of stories about her youth. "Yes, that's right." "Jesus Christ, Mom, you called your high school boyfriend? Are you having some kind of breakdown?" The cruel edge in his voice was unmistakable now, and Pauline felt something crystallize inside her, a clarity she hadn't possessed when she'd called him from the ruins of her house. "No, David, I'm not having a breakdown. I'm having a breakthrough." "What's that supposed to mean?" She looked across the table at Thomas, who was pretending to read the newspaper but was obviously listening. He caught her eye and nodded encouragingly. "It means I finally understand something about love and loyalty, about what family is supposed to mean." "Mom, you're not making sense. Look, why don't you come up here for a few days, just until you figure out a more permanent solution? Linda and I talked about it, and we can put you up in the guest room temporarily." Temporarily. The word hung in the air like a judgment. After 5 days of being welcomed without conditions, of being valued simply for who she was, rather than managed like a problem to be solved, David's grudging offer felt like the insult it was. "That's very generous of you," she said quietly, "but I don't think that will be necessary." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've found somewhere I'm actually wanted. Somewhere I don't have to apologize for needing help or promise to be temporary." "Mom, you can't just—" "David," she interrupted him gently but firmly. "I love you. You're my son, and that will never change. But I don't think I like you very much right now. And I don't think you like me either. That's not— When you're ready to have a relationship with your mother, instead of managing me like a burden, call me back. Otherwise, I'll be fine. I have someone who actually cares about my well-being." She hung up before he could respond. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she felt oddly calm, as if she'd finally said something true after years of polite deception. "That sounded difficult," Thomas said. "It was, but also necessary." She picked up her wine glass and took a sip. "I've been making excuses for his behavior for so long that I'd almost convinced myself it was normal, that I was expecting too much. And now? Now I know what it feels like to be cared for again, to be valued, and I'm not willing to settle for less anymore." They finished dinner in companionable silence, the weight of her conversation with David settling around them like a shared understanding. Later, as they cleaned up the dishes, Thomas asked the question she'd been dreading. "What's your plan, Polly? Long term, I mean." She dried a plate carefully before answering. "I don't know. The insurance money will eventually come through, but even when it does, I'm not sure I want to rebuild in Millbrook. Too many memories, and not enough future." She paused. "I've been thinking about what David said, about downsizing, maybe moving somewhere completely new." "Where would you go?" "I don't know that either. Somewhere warmer, maybe. Somewhere I could start over." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. What if you didn't start over alone?" The plate slipped from her hands, but Thomas caught it before it could hit the floor. They stood there in his kitchen, both holding the same piece of china, the question hanging between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. "Thomas, I know it's crazy. I know we're too old to be talking about running away together. But Polly, these past few days, it's like finding a part of myself I thought was gone forever." She looked up into his eyes and saw the same mix of hope and terror she felt in her own heart. "We don't really know each other anymore. We're different people than we were 50 years ago." "Are we? Because when I look at you, when we're talking or sitting together in the evenings, I see the same woman I fell in love with in 1968. Older, wiser, more beautiful for everything she survived, but essentially the same. I see you too, the boy I loved grown into someone I could love even more." She touched his face gently. "But love isn't enough, is it? We learned that the first time around. Maybe love isn't enough when you're 18 and terrified of disappointing everyone. But we're not 18 anymore, Polly. We're 73 and 75, and the people whose approval we were so worried about are mostly dead. Our parents, gone. Your husband, my wife, gone. Our children are adults with their own lives, their own problems. What's left except what we want for ourselves?" She turned away from him, afraid of the intensity in his voice, afraid of how much she wanted to believe him. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop being careful. I'm suggesting we choose love this time, even if it's messy and complicated and everyone thinks we're having senior moments." He moved behind her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I'm suggesting we remember what it felt like to believe that anything was possible. And go where? Do what? I don't know. Maybe we could find a little place in one of those mountain towns in Colorado near my daughter Lisa. Or maybe we could actually make it to California after all these years, get a cottage near the ocean. Or hell, maybe we could stay right here and let the neighbors gossip about the old fool who moved his high school sweetheart into his house." "You're serious." "Dead serious. Polly, I've been alone for 5 years. Good alone, mostly. I've made my peace with solitude. But these past few days with you here, I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone to talk to at the end of the day. Someone who understands the references I make, who remembers the same songs and movies and moments in history. Someone who knew me before I became whoever I am now. Thomas, we could be making a terrible mistake. We could destroy the good memories we have of each other. We could. Or we could create some new ones. He took her hands in his. What's the worst that could happen? We break up? At our age, how much heartbreak are we really risking? What's the best that could happen? We get a few good years together. Maybe more. We get to find out what we might have been. That night, Pauline lay awake in the guest room staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear Thomas moving around in his bedroom, probably as sleepless as she was. The house felt different now, charged with possibility and the weight of an unmade decision. She thought about her conversation with David, about the casual cruelty in his voice when he had suggested she might be having a breakdown. She thought about the insurance money sitting in an account, enough to start over anywhere she wanted. She thought about the empty years stretching ahead of her, the slow decline into true old age, the gradual shrinking of possibilities. And she thought about Thomas, about the way he looked at her like she was still worth looking at, about his easy laughter and gentle hands, and the way he dropped everything to come for her when she needed help. At 3 a.m, she got up and padded quietly to the kitchen for a glass of water. Thomas was there already, sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a book that he didn't seem to be reading. Couldn't sleep either? He asked. Too much thinking. She poured herself water from the pitcher in the refrigerator and sat across from him. Can I ask you something? Anything. Why now? Why are you willing to take this risk now when you weren't 50 years ago? He considered the question, absently turning his wedding ring. He still wore it, she'd noticed, though his wife had been dead for 5 years. 50 years ago, I had everything to lose and nothing to compare it to. I thought love was enough to overcome anything. Practical problems, family disapproval, financial struggles. I was young enough to believe in fairy tales. Now I know that love isn't enough on its own, but I also know how rare it is. I've had a good life, Polly. I've been married to a wonderful woman, raised 2 daughters, had a career I enjoyed. I know what it's like to build something steady and lasting with someone you care about. And what we had was different. What we have now is different. It's not better or worse than what I had with Janet, just different, more passionate, maybe more fragile, definitely more complicated. He reached across the table and touched her hand. When Janet was dying, she told me something. She said she hoped I'd find someone to love after she was gone, because she couldn't bear the thought of me being alone for the rest of my life. She said she wanted me to be happy, even if it meant loving someone else. Pauline felt tears prick her eyes. She sounds like an extraordinary woman. She was. And you know what? I think you would have liked her. I think she would have understood why I'm willing to risk everything for a chance to see what we might become. They sat in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the accumulated debris of Thomas's life. Photographs on the refrigerator, bills stacked neatly on the counter, Django's food bowls by the back door. It was the life of a man who had learned to be content with his own company, who had found peace in routine and solitude. I'm scared, Pauline said finally. Good. So am I. If we weren't scared, it wouldn't be worth doing. What about your daughters? What will they think? They'll think their old man has lost his mind, and then they'll get to know you and they'll understand. He smiled. Besides, they've been after me for years to start dating again. They just didn't expect me to start with someone from 1968. Despite everything, Pauline found herself laughing. When you put it like that, it does sound insane. The best decisions usually do. She looked around the kitchen, at this small, domestic space where she'd felt more at home in a week than she had in her own house in years. She thought about the choice she'd made 50 years ago,
the safe path that had led to a good life, but not necessarily a passionate one. She thought about David's voice on the phone, about the careful distance he maintained from anything that might be messy or inconvenient. And she thought about the girl she'd been at 18, so afraid of disappointing people that she disappointed herself instead. If we do this, she said slowly, if we actually try to build something together, we have to promise each other that we'll be honest, no protecting each other's feelings, no pretending things are fine when they're not. We're too old for games. Agreed. And we have to promise that if it doesn't work, we'll end it kindly. We won't let this destroy what we've found again. Agreed. And we have to promise to give it time, not to run at the first sign of trouble or the first moment when we remember why it didn't work 50 years ago. Thomas stood up and came around the table to her. Pauline, are you saying yes? She looked up at him, this man who had driven 4 hours to rescue her from the worst day of her life, who had offered her shelter without conditions, who was now offering her something even more precious, a second chance at the love they'd lost. I'm saying yes. He kissed her then, gently at first, and then with the passion of two people who had waited 50 years for a second chance. It was different from the kisses they'd shared as teenagers, deeper, more knowing, flavored with the understanding of everything they'd learned about love and loss in the intervening decades. When they separated, Pauline felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the thrilling, terrifying sensation of standing at the beginning of something rather than the end. So, what now? She asked. Now we figure it out as we go, just like everyone else. The next morning, over coffee and the crossword puzzle, they began making plans. Thomas had been thinking about selling his house anyway. It was too big for one person, and the maintenance was becoming burdensome. They could pool their resources, buy something smaller in a new place, start fresh together. What about Colorado? Thomas suggested. Lisa's been wanting me to move closer, and the mountains might be good for both of us. I've never lived anywhere but Indiana. It might be good to try somewhere completely different. They spent the morning looking at real estate websites, laughing at some of the more outrageous properties and seriously considering others. It felt like playing house, except they were 73 and 75 years old and had survived enough of life to know that dreams could actually come true if you were brave enough to pursue them. Around noon, Pauline's phone rang. The caller ID showed David's number. Want me to give you some privacy? No, stay. She answered the phone. Hello, David. Mom, I owe you an apology. His voice was different, less controlled, more vulnerable than she'd heard him sound in years. Linda and I talked after you hung up on me, and she made it clear that I've been a complete ass. Linda said that? Linda said much worse than that. She reminded me that when her father died, you drove up here and stayed for 2 weeks helping with the arrangements and taking care of the kids while she fell apart. She said you've never once made us feel like we owed you anything, and the one time you actually needed help, I acted like you were imposing on us. Pauline felt a flutter of surprise and gratitude toward her daughter-in-law, who had always been polite but distant. She's right, Mom. I was protecting our privacy, but from what? From my own mother who raised me and loved me and never asked for anything in return until her house was destroyed by a tornado? He paused, and she could hear the emotion in his voice. I'm ashamed of myself. David? No, let me finish. I want you to come stay with us. Not temporarily, not as a burden we're grudgingly accepting, but because you're my mother, and I love you, and I want to help. We have plenty of space, and the kids would love to have their grandmother around more. Please, Mom, let me try to be a better son. 6 months ago, even a week ago, this call would have been everything Pauline wanted to hear. The son she'd raised finally remembering who he was supposed to be, offering her exactly what she'd been hoping for. Now, sitting in Thomas's kitchen with real estate listings spread across the table and the taste of possibilities still lingering from the conversation the night before, she felt something she'd never expected, the luxury of choice. I appreciate that, David, more than you know. And I'm glad Linda talked some sense into you. She reached across the table and took Thomas's hand. But I'm not sure that's what I want anymore. What do you mean? I mean, I've been thinking about what I want for the next chapter of my life. And I don't think that involves being someone's grateful dependent, even someone I love as much as I love you. David, you wouldn't be dependent. You'd be family. Would I? Would I have a say in family decisions, or would I be the elderly relative you consult out of politeness but don't really expect to have opinions? Would you and Linda ask my advice about the children, or would you make it clear that I'm welcome to babysit but not to parent? Would I be an equal member of the household, or would I be living in your space on your terms? The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. I thought so, she said gently. David, you're offering me exactly what I asked for a week ago, and I'm grateful. But sometimes we don't know what we really need until we experience something different. What do you mean? I mean, I've been thinking about what I want for the next chapter of my life, and I don't think that involves being someone's grateful dependent, even someone I love as much as I love you. David, you wouldn't be dependent. You'd be family. Would I? Would I have a say in family decisions, or would I be the elderly relative you consult out of politeness but don't really expect to have opinions? Would you and Linda ask my advice about the children, or would you make it clear that I'm welcome to babysit but not to parent? Would I be an equal member of the household, or would I be living in your space on your terms? The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. I thought so, she said gently. David, you're offering me exactly what I asked for a week ago, and I'm grateful. But sometimes we don't know what we really need until we experience something different. What do you mean? I mean, I've been thinking about what I want for the next chapter of my life, and I don't think that involves being someone's grateful dependent, even someone I love as much as I love you. David, you wouldn't be dependent. You'd be family. Mom, you can't be serious about this guy. You haven't seen him in 50 years. It's rebound behavior. You're vulnerable and he's taking advantage of that. The old Pauline would have second-guessed herself, would have wondered if David was right. The new Pauline, the woman who had been cherished and valued and treated as an equal partner for the past week, felt only a calm certainty. David, I'm 73 years old. I'm not rebounding from anything. I'm choosing love over security, passion over comfort, possibility over certainty. I'm choosing to be brave instead of careful. This is crazy, Mom. Maybe, but it's my kind of crazy. She could hear him talking to Linda in the background, their voices too low to make out the words. When he came back on the line, he sounded defeated. Where will you go? Colorado, probably. Thomas has a daughter there, and we both like the idea of mountains. When? Soon, within the month if we can find the right place. Mom, I know I haven't been the son you deserved. I know I've been selfish and distant and taken you for granted, but please don't disappear from our lives. Please don't punish Emma and Michael for my mistakes. For the first time in the conversation, Pauline felt her resolve waver. Her grandchildren, she couldn't bear the thought of losing them. I'm not disappearing, David. I'm moving. There's a difference. You and the children will always be welcome to visit, and I'll come back for important occasions. But I won't live my life within driving distance just in case you need something from me. And if this thing with Thomas doesn't work out? She looked across the table at Thomas, who was listening unabashedly now, his eyes warm with understanding and support. Then I'll figure something else out, but I won't come running back to be managed and tolerated and treated like a burden. I'm worth more than that, David. It took me 73 years to really believe it, but I'm worth more than that. When she hung up the phone, Thomas reached over and squeezed her hand. That was well done. Was it? I feel like I just told my son that I'm choosing you over him. You didn't choose me over him. You chose yourself over the version of yourself he wanted you to be. 2 weeks later, they found a house. It was a small, craftsman-style cottage in a mountain town outside Denver, with a view of the peaks and a garden that had been lovingly tended by its previous owner. The real estate agent seemed slightly bemused by their situation. Two elderly people from different states, buying a house together after knowing each other for less than a month. But Thomas's pre-approval letter and Pauline's insurance settlement made them serious buyers. "It needs some work," the agent warned as they walked through the rooms. "The kitchen could use updating and the hardwood floors will need refinishing." "We have time," Thomas said, his arm around Pauline's shoulders as they stood in the living room, sunlight streaming through the windows. "And we have each other." They closed on the house 3 weeks later, on a crisp October morning with the aspen trees turning gold on the mountainsides. Thomas sold his place in Wisconsin with surprising speed. Apparently, there were quite a few people looking for quiet houses in rural areas. Django adapted to the move with the resilience of a dog who trusts his humans to make good decisions. Lisa, Thomas's daughter, drove down from Denver to help them settle in. She was a warm, practical woman in her 40s who seemed genuinely delighted that her father had found love again. "I was worried about him rattling around in that big house all by himself. He was getting a little too comfortable with solitude, if you know what I mean." "And now?" Lisa smiled. "Now he hums while he makes coffee in the morning. He hasn't done that since Mom died." The first few weeks were an adjustment. They had to learn each other's rhythms, negotiate the small domestic compromises that all couples face. Thomas liked to stay up late reading. Pauline was an early riser. She was methodical about household tasks. He was more spontaneous. He left coffee cups on random surfaces. She put things away immediately. But they also discovered new compatibilities. They both loved crossword puzzles and old movies. They shared a dry sense of humor and a tendency toward political arguments that never quite turned into real fights. In the evenings, Thomas would play guitar while Pauline read, and sometimes she would sing along to songs they both remembered from their youth. They made friends in the small mountain community, other retirees, younger families, the eclectic mix of people drawn to places where the air is thin and the possibilities feel endless. Their story, high school sweethearts reunited after 50 years, became part of the local folklore, told and retold at dinner parties and coffee shops until it took on an almost mythical quality. "We're like something out of a romance novel," Pauline said one evening, as they sat on their back porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. "Better," Thomas replied. "Romance novels are written by people who think love is easy. We know better." 3 months into their new life together, David called to tell them he was getting divorced. "Linda wants me to move out," he said, his voice hollow with shock. "She says she can't be married to someone who would treat his own mother the way I treated you. She says if I could abandon you when you needed help, what would I do to her when things got difficult?" Pauline felt a complicated mixture of sorrow for David and vindication for herself. "I'm sorry to hear that, sweetheart. She's right, you know, about what kind of person I've become. I don't like myself very much these days." "Then change," Pauline said simply. "You're 45 years old, David. You have time to become the man you want to be instead of the man you are." "How do I do that?" "The same way everyone does it. One day at a time, one better choice at a time." "Will you help me? I know I don't deserve it, but I don't want to lose you completely. I don't want my children to grow up without knowing their grandmother." She looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "Of course I'll help. But David, this time, you come to me. You make the effort. You show me that I matter to you. Don't just tell me." "I will. I promise. And when you're ready, bring Emma and Michael for a visit. I want them to see the mountains, and I want them to meet Thomas. They'd like that. They've been asking about you." After she hung up, Thomas moved his chair closer to hers and took her hand. "You did good. We'll see. David's had a lot of practice being selfish. Change doesn't happen overnight." "No, but it does happen. Look at us." She considered this. In 4 months, she'd gone from being a widow living alone in a house too full of memories to being half of a couple building a new life in a place she'd never seen before. She'd gone from accepting her son's neglect as normal to demanding better treatment. She'd gone from believing her romantic life was over to waking up each morning beside a man who still looked at her like she was beautiful. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, "giving up your old life for this uncertainty?" "Every day," Thomas said. "And then I wake up next to you and I remember that some uncertainties are worth it." Spring came early to the mountains that year. By March, the snow was melting and the first wildflowers were pushing through the earth in their garden. Pauline had never been much of a gardener. Harold had handled the yard work in their old life, but she found herself drawn to the prospect of planting something new, of tending growing things. Thomas, it turned out, had a gift for vegetables. He sectioned off part of the backyard for tomatoes and peppers and herbs, while Pauline claimed a sunny spot near the house for flowers. They worked side by side in the warming earth, planning and planting and arguing good-naturedly about spacing and varieties. "We're like an old married couple," Pauline said one afternoon, as they sat on the back steps, sharing a beer and admiring their handiwork. "Except we're not married," Thomas pointed out. "No, we're not." They discussed it, obliquely, in the way that people their age discuss things that might not matter in the practical sense, but somehow matter emotionally. There were legal benefits to marriage, insurance, inheritance, medical decisions, but there were also complications. His social security, her pension, the children who might have opinions about their parents' choices. "Would you want to be?" Thomas asked, now, as directly as he'd ever addressed the subject. Pauline considered the question. Marriage at their age was more symbol than necessity. They were already committed to each other in all the ways that mattered, but symbols had power, and there was something appealing about the idea of publicly claiming each other, of making promises they intended to keep for whatever time they had left. "Are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'd say yes if I asked." "I'm saying I might." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Django chase butterflies through the garden. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the sound of their neighbor mowing his lawn, the ordinary domestic symphony of a spring afternoon. "You know what I love about this?" Thomas said. "The suspense? The fact that we're having this conversation at all. 50 years ago, we thought we knew everything about love. We thought it was all passion and drama and grand gestures. We had no idea it could be this, quiet and comfortable and still surprising. You think this is better? I think this is different. I think we're different. I think we've learned how to love with our eyes open instead of closed." That evening, as they cooked dinner together, Thomas handling the actual cooking while Pauline managed the logistics, they heard a car pull into their driveway. Through the kitchen window, they could see David getting out of a rental car, followed by two children Pauline barely recognized. Emma had grown tall and serious-looking, with David's dark hair and Harold's thoughtful eyes. Michael was broader now, 15 and awkward in the way of teenage boys everywhere. They stood uncertainly in the driveway, looking around at the mountains and the unfamiliar house, clearly out of their element. "They came," Pauline said, surprised by the sudden tightness in her throat. "They came," Thomas agreed. "You ready for this?" She smoothed her hair and untied her apron, trying to transform herself from domestic partner to grandmother in the space of a moment. "I think so." David looked older, she noticed, as they walked outside to greet their visitors. The stress of his failing marriage had carved new lines around his eyes, and he'd lost weight in an unhealthy way. But there was something different in his posture, a humility that hadn't been there before. "Mom," he said, and hugged her with an intensity that caught her off guard. "You look happy." "I am happy." He turned to Thomas, extending his hand with the careful politeness of a man trying to make amends. "Mr. McKenna, thank you for taking such good care of my mother. She takes care of herself. I just try to keep up." Emma and Michael hung back, uncertain of their place in this reunion. Pauline approached them carefully, not wanting to overwhelm them with the emotional intensity she felt at seeing them again. "You've both grown so much," she said. "Emma, you're going to be taller than your father soon. And Michael, I hardly recognized you." "Hi, Grandma," Emma said shyly. "Dad said you moved to the mountains because of a tornado?" "That's right. Would you like to see the house and the garden we're planting?" The next few hours passed in a blur of tentative conversation and careful bridge building. David was trying hard, too hard, perhaps, but the effort was genuine. He complimented the house, asked thoughtful questions about their move, and made a visible effort to include Thomas in the conversation. The children were more reserved, clearly processing the reality of their grandmother's new life, But as the evening progressed, they began to relax. Emmer was charmed by Django and interested in the garden. Michael, initially suspicious of Thomas, was won over when he discovered the older man played guitar and was willing to teach him a few chords. "He's nice," Michael told Pauline privately as they cleared the dinner dishes. "Different from what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone weird, I guess. Someone who was trying to take advantage of you." "And now?" Michael shrugged with the elaborate casualness of 15. "Now I think maybe Dad was wrong about some things." That night, after David and the children had settled into the local hotel, Pauline's house had only 2 bedrooms, and she wasn't quite ready for the complexity of hosting extended family overnight. She and Thomas sat on the porch processing the visit. "That went well. Better than I expected. David really is trying to be different. People can change if they want to badly enough. And the children, they're good kids. David and Linda did something right, even if their marriage is falling apart. They'll be fine. Kids are resilient, especially when they know they're loved." They sat quietly for a while, listening to the night sounds of their mountain community. Owls calling from the trees, the distant sound of a neighbor's television, the whisper of wind through the aspen leaves. "Thomas," Pauline said, "ask me." "Ask you what?" "You know what." He turned to look at her in the darkness, and she could see the smile spreading across his face. "Pauline Mercer, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "Yes, I will." They were married 6 weeks later, on a bright May morning in their own backyard, with the mountains as their cathedral and their newly planted garden as their altar. Lisa and her family came from Denver, along with David and the children. Even Sarah flew in from Seattle, bringing her husband and teenage daughter. The ceremony was simple: a local justice of the peace, a few friends from their new community, and the people they loved most. Pauline wore a blue dress she'd bought specially for the occasion, and Thomas wore his only suit, with a guitar pick as a boutonniere. Django served as ring bearer, with the ring bands attached to his collar. "At our age," the justice of the peace said with a smile, "we know that marriage isn't about promising to love each other forever. It's about promising to love each other for whatever time we have. Pauline and Thomas, you've already proven that love can survive separation, that it can endure loss, that it can be patient enough to wait 50 years for a second chance." When they kissed as husband and wife, their family and friends erupted in applause, and Pauline felt something she hadn't experienced since she was 18 years old: the absolute certainty that anything was possible. The tornado had taken her house, her possessions, and her illusions about the people she could count on. But it had also blown away the careful compromises and quiet disappointments that had accumulated over 50 years of living carefully. In the space left behind, she'd found room for something she thought was lost forever: the courage to choose love over security, passion over comfort, possibility over certainty. As they danced to the song Thomas played on his guitar, the same song they had danced to at their high school prom 57 years earlier, Pauline closed her eyes and felt the wind that had brought them back together. Not the destructive force that had leveled her old life, but the gentle breeze that carries seeds to new ground, that makes space for unexpected blooming, that reminds us that even in the deepest winter, spring is always coming. "No regrets?" Thomas whispered in her ear as they swayed together in their garden, surrounded by family and friends and the endless possibility of the mountains. "No regrets," she whispered back. "Only gratitude." And for the first time in years, maybe for the first time in her life, Pauline Mercer McKenna was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to be with, living exactly the life she was brave enough to choose. The wind that had destroyed everything had also, in the end, given her everything. Sometimes, she realized, that's how miracles work. Not by giving us what we think we want, but by taking away what we think we need, making space for what we never dared to hope for. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the peaks, promising rain for their garden and thunder to shake the mountains. But Pauline was no longer afraid of storms. She'd learned that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the spaces left behind when the wind stops blowing and the sun comes out again.